Let's create a custom recipe type for our crafting block entity. Even more topics available in the 121 Minecraft modding courses, now with energy and fluid handling for block entities next to many other awesome topics. Alright, we find ourselves back in Terraria once more, and in this tutorial we're going to be adding a custom recipe type for our growth chamber block entity that, of course, last time we defined, or we basically created with a hard-coded recipe, so to speak, right, where we could only input raw bismuth and we would get out 8 normal bismuth. But now, this is going to get like supercharged because we're going to make it so that you can have a custom recipe, and all of those are then, generatable or, creatable via a JSON file or via JSON files, meaning you can have, basically an infinite amount. And not only that, other mods in theory would also be able to make their own recipes and all things like that. Now, the recipe, actual custom recipe, isn't that crazy to create. And then also the logic in the block entity is also not as crazy. However, there's like 1 or 2 things that are a little bit of a strange one, because we do have to work with codecs, some of which we will be copying over. So I, as per usual, highly recommend you go down to the description into the GitHub repository to check out the code there and basically have that open, simultaneously while we're going through this. Now for this, in the tutorial mod package, we're going to make a new package called a recipe. Inside there, we'll need 3 new Java classes. The first one is going to be the mod recipes class. The second one is going to be the growth chamber recipe. And the last one is going to be the growth chamber recipe input. And we will start with the chamber recipe input because that one is super simple. This is going to be not a class, but a record. And the record is going to have an item stack. We're going to call this the input. And it will implement the recipe input interface. We'll hover over this to implement the 2 methods, the get size as well as the get item method. And here, luckily, because we have a size of 1, we can simply return a 1. And in the item stack, we can simply return the input. Now, it could be the case that your recipe input is actually more than just 1 item, right? And if that's the case, then obviously you need to change this. Highly recommend it to, for example, check out the crafting input where, well, here, obviously you have a crafting input that has a width and a height associated with it because you have a, let's say, a 3x3 or a 2x2 area, and therefore you need a much more complicated class, right, in the crafting input. When it comes to the single recipe input, we could in theory also take this. However, I had this not work before, so I just made a custom one over here. And then also smithing input, for example, that needs, of course, a template as well as a base, as well as an additional item. So therefore, you can sort of see how that all fits together. And we'll use this recipe input in just a second inside of the recipe class itself. And I'll explain what exactly the input does in just a second. But the growth chamber recipe over here, how does this one look like? Well, very straightforward, actually. It is also a record, crazily enough, and it's going to have an ingredient. We're going to call this the input item, and it also has an item stack, which is going to be the output, and it will implement the recipe interface of a type growth chamber recipe input. So we're going to then implement the methods. As you can see, quite a few of them. It is what it is, but that's going to be okay. And here we start by thinking about, okay, what is this craziness even, what are we even looking at, let's say? So the idea is as follows. When we have a recipe, we obviously have sort of 2 different things that we need to check, right? So we need to read in a JSON file, right? Okay, I think this first step, hopefully understandable, because we've seen previously, I don't even know if we have the recipes still here. We have the recipes here, though, in the generated one, data, tutorial mod, or recipe, right? So obviously, if we were to have this crafting shaped one, this somehow needs to be read in and understood by the program. I think this far, hopefully everyone can still follow. And when you read in this file, and that's all fine and well, and we now have sort of all of our recipes, let's say like somewhere in a list, but we then also need to think about, well, okay, we now have opened our growth chamber, right? So we have, let's just, for the sake of argument over here, we've opened our GUI over here, and now we put an item inside of here, right? Now it obviously needs to check, okay, does this item somehow have a recipe associated with it? But you have to think about this a little bit more generically, let's say, like a little bit more generally. If you had like 3 different slots, you obviously need to check each one of those slots. Okay, does this have an item associated with it? And does this item have a recipe associated with it? And this is what the growth or what the recipe class does, right? So it first of all reads in the JSON file, and let's say it sort of saves all of the recipes in a whole long list, just for you to sort of understand what is going on. And then when you have the growth chamber, it then checks all of the recipes that exist. And if it matches one of them, hey, then we have a recipe and we can do stuff. And that's sort of what we need to do here. And the first thing to do here is we need the get ingredients method to, well, basically to override this, just so that we can get the ingredients. Now, the reason why this is a non-null list is if we were to once again take a look at the crafting recipe, I believe, or I guess rather the shapeless crafting recipe, that actually has a non-null list of ingredients, because of course in this case, it has multiple inputs, whereas we only have one input. So this ingredient right here, this is our input. Now, you might say, well, what about this input right here? I can see where the sort of issue might arise. The ingredient and the item stack right here, these two things, those are read from a JSON file, right? So this is, so let's just write this down. Why not, right? So this is going to be input item and output. Those are read from JSON file. Okay, so now we know whatever we have, right, in this input and in this output variable, those were the things that were read from the JSON file. Whereas the growth recipe input, that is the inventory of the block entity, right? As like a highest level overview, right? So the growth chamber recipe input, that is whatever we have put in here. Or, like I said, if we have multiple different slots over here, then we could, look at all of those slots and determine whether or not the input item or input items match the input of the inventory. So first of all, we want to get the ingredients read from the JSON file. We're going to do this by doing a non-null list of ingredient. I'm going to call this the list equal to non-null list.create. And we're going to say list.add the input item. And we're simply going to return this list right here. Of course, if you have multiple input items, you can immediately just make a non-null list over here. But this is going to be a little bit further or, a little bit more complicated for the time being. We're just going to keep it like this. Now in the matches method, here it gets very interesting. First of all, we want to say if level.is client side, we simply return false. Very important. And then this matches method is super important because this determines whether or not the input read in from the file and the input from the inventory match, right? That's why it's called the matches method. This is also where you have this growth chamber recipe input right here and available, right? Because here is where you basically check whether or not those match. And this is, of course, can be way more complicated if you have more input slots, if you have more JSON file or more inputs from the JSON file, then you need to make a more complicated construction here for the Boolean. In our case, it's actually very straightforward. We simply want to ask if the input from the JSON file that we've read in, right, if that is the same as the input growth chamber recipe input that get 0, right? If those two match, then we know we got a recipe, this is true, and we can continue soaring along and actually make some cool stuff happen. We get to the assemble method where we simply return output.get, output.copy. A crafting dimensions is just going to be true, and the get result item is simply going to be the output again. And then we get to the crazy stuff, because the crazy stuff is the recipe type as well as the serializer. So the both of those, we actually want to make deliberate errors because we can't actually return those just yet. However, we can in just a second. And for the serializer, it actually gets a little bit crazier as well, because that's going to be a class, a static class within our recipe class. So we're going to have a public static class. It's going to be a class serializer, there we go, which will implement the recipe serializer of type growth chamber recipe. There we go. And this is going to look kind of like this. We want to hover over this to implement the stream codec as well as the codec methods. And those two are the things that we need to add in the serializer. Now, this is for how do we read in the JSON file. We've previously determined, all right, the input, or the ingredient right here, as well as the output, those were both read in from a JSON file. But now we have to define, okay, how do we even read in this JSON file, right? It's like, you can't just say, well, those are the things that we read in from a JSON file, but the program somehow needs to know, okay, how do I read this in? And that happens via the map codec. Now, I am not an expert at codecs. This is, and basically Minecraft modding, or Minecraft in general, has slowly morphed into more and more codec stuff. They are super powerful, however, they can get complicated very, very fast. What I highly recommend you do, once again, for some amount of inspiration here, you go to the recipe serializer, Control H, and you can, for example, take a look at the shaped recipe codec, or the shaped recipe serializer, and you can see this is the map codec for it, right? You can see we use a record codec builder, and then we map certain fields to the fields of the JSON file, and then for a getter inside of the class. So I'm going to copy over the code over here and then explain it on the code itself that we have. So here you can see the codec. This is a map codec of a growth chamber recipe. The idea is as follows. We are going to have a JSON file that is formatted in a particular way. And out of this JSON file, I will be able to create a new growth chamber recipe class instance, right? So a new instance of this particular class. How am I going to be able to do this? Well, inside of the JSON file, I'm going to look for an ingredient field, right? This is the name of the input, or the ingredient inside of the JSON file. And that is going to be created as the input item, right? So whatever I read in there, that's going to be the input item. And then simultaneously, I will also have a result field inside of the JSON file, and that is going to be created as the output. And that's how all of this fits together. Once again, there are more complicated structures that you can make with codecs, but that's the highest level overview in this case, hopefully somewhat understandable. And that is the map codec. Awesome. Now here, we can simply return the codec, but we also need a stream codec. The stream codec, I would say, is semi more complicated, but that looks kind of like this. Here we're making a composite stream codec, and you can see once again, we're sort of saying, okay, we have an ingredient, and that is the input item. We have an item stack, and that is the output, and that creates a new growth chamber recipe. The reason why we need this stream codec is so that the server and client can also communicate the same thing, right? So this is read in from a JSON file, right? The map codec, whereas the stream codec is, let's say, like sent via the network in highest level overview. And we can then simply return the stream codec here, and that is the serializer class done. Like I said, if you have more complicated block entities and more complicated serializers at that point, that's totally fine. You will need to, test it out, take a look at, I highly recommend, take a look at the recipe serializers of vanilla. They will be super useful, I'm telling you. But that is basically the entire growth chamber recipe class done, except of course for these two, but we need to actually register everything in order to return two proper things there. And let's take a look. So in the mod recipe class, we're going to have two deferred registers. Crazily enough, it's going to be public static final deferred register of type recipe serializer. So there's going to be the recipe serializer of type question mark. It's going to be the serializers equal to deferred register.create registries dot recipe serializer. And this is tutorial mod.modID. There we go. And we're just going to duplicate this. Whenever you duplicate, be very, very careful. Recipe type, because it's very easy to make a typo. This is going to be the recipe. This is going to be the type, so I think that is fair. And this is going to be for the recipe type. This should be fine. Double check the description below for the GitHub repository, of course, if you have any doubts about the code or anything like that. Highly recommend it, because obviously the recipe class is quite involved as well. And of course, to copy it over the codec over here, highly recommend it to check it out there. And that's going to be hopefully fine and understandable. And I also have another resource in just a second, which I will share with you. Just let's finish the register method over here, obviously calling the serializers.register, passing in the I-event bus, and the same thing for the types. And then you need tutorial mod constructor. You have to call mod recipes.register, passing in the mod event bus. And there we freaking go. And we can then register both the type as well as the serializer. Let's start with the serializer. Public static final deferred holder of type recipe type serializer question mark. And then the second type is recipe serializer of type growth chamber recipe. So growth chamber recipe. This is the growth underscore chamber underscore serializer equal to the serializers dot register growth underscore chamber. And then the second parameter is growth chamber recipe serializer : new. Awesome. That is going to be that. The recipe type, straightforward as it can be, is a public static final deferred holder of type recipe type question mark, comma. The second type is recipe type, of course, growth chamber recipe. This is the growth _ chamber _ type, equal to types.register. This is the growth. We're going to call this growth _ chamber. This is a supplier of a new recipe type of type growth chamber. And you can see it makes this an anonymous class. That's fine. And here we actually, I believe, need to override the toString method, if I recall correctly. Or yes, the toString method gets, we need to override that one. And here, I think we're just going to simply do a growth _ chamber, and that should be that. That's all we need to do. And now the type as well as the serializer are properly registered. So we can go back to the growth chamber recipe. For the type over here, crazy enough, it's going to be mod recipes.growthChamberType.get. And then for the serializer, it is mod recipes.growthChamberSerializer.get. And there we go. That is going to be both of those done. That is the entire recipe class done as well. And now the recipe itself can be read in, and it all should work. Now, one final thing on the codecs, what I highly recommend you do is there is a great documentation on codecs when it comes to NeoForge. Luckily, they are actually pretty freaking awesome on codecs. That's going to be right here. I will link this down below. Let's actually go down to 1.21. There you go. And this is absolutely fantastic. It basically describes all of the different primitive codec types that there are. It sort of tells you, okay, how can you create a codec? What is a codec? How do you, define this? It is absolutely fantastic. This is probably the best resource that exists for codecs right now. Highly recommended to check this out if you're really interested in how all of those work. But yeah, for the time being, we're going to keep it like this, and we're just going to hopefully like everything I explained was, well enough explained for you to understand at least the basics on how that works. Finally, now that we actually have all of this done and the recipe is finished, we now, of course, need to somehow, change the growth chamber block entity to actually use this recipe, right? Because, of course, right now, it's not using the recipe. We still have everything hard-coded over here. Now, luckily, this is super simple because of the way that we've defined the tick method, right? The way that this works, it's going to be super simple. You have the hasRecipe method, which we can simply change a little bit, right? So, first of all, in the hasRecipe method, now the question is, well, wait a second, do we even have a recipe? And we can very easily do this. So we can say optional of type recipe holder of type growth chamber recipe. We're going to call this the recipe, and this is going to be equal to the get current recipe method. Now the get current recipe method doesn't exist, so we're going to create this, and you'll see why I create a method for this in just a second. It's not that complicated though. We're going to return this .level .get recipe manager .get recipe for mod recipes growth chamber type.get. So we're going to get basically all of the recipes for the growth chamber type. So this is now going to get us the quote unquote list of all of the recipes. And then we're going to make sure that we actually have one. So how do we match this? Well, we match this with a new growth chamber recipe input. And the input here is going to be item handler.get stack in slot input slot. And then after the second closing parenthesis, we have to pass in the level, and there we go. So the idea is that we're going to check all of the recipes that have the growth chamber recipe type, and we're going to check them against the recipe input. And like I said, the recipe input is whatever we have inside of the inventory. And of course, here we need to then pass in whatever we have in our input slot, which is going to be this slot right here. So it's going to check for every single recipe that has been read in via the JSON file. And it's going to say, hey, does this one match it? Does this one match it? Does this one match it? So this all happens via the matches method, where it gets exactly this recipe input that we're creating right here. That's going to be passed in right here. And it's going to say, hey, we read in, whatever it might be, a stick. Is there a stick in there? No. Is there raw bismuth in there? No. Is there a diamond in there? Yes. Now let's create something. That's the idea. And that is what happens there. Hopefully understandable in what happens in this case. And it is an optional because sometimes there might not be a recipe for whatever input we have. And so what we can say in the hasRecipe method is we can say if the recipe is empty, meaning that there is nothing there, we can simply return a false because no recipe has been found. However, if we haven't returned this, then we know down here we actually have a recipe. So instead of hard coding our output, we're actually going to say recipe.get.value.output, because this is the actual output that we have for our like recipe. And there we go. Another crazy thing is that because we've defined the input right here in the get current recipe, we don't even need to do this in this return, because we don't want to look only for raw bismuth. We want to look for any input that has a recipe associated with it. So we can simply delete this and simply keep the can insert amount into and can insert item into output slot. So that is step number 1, has recipe, totally changed, but way better in this case. And the second thing that we want to change is the craft item method, because here, once again, we still have this thing hard-coded, right? So the output here is still hard-coded, but luckily it doesn't have to be, because we once again can get an optional of a recipe holder of growth chamber recipe. That's going to be our recipe equal to the get current recipe method. And then in the output, we're going to have the same thing, recipe.get.value.output. And that is it. Now we know when the craft item method is called that the has recipe is true. Therefore, we don't need to check whether or not it's empty, because we know that it's not empty here. Now this deals with the output. It doesn't quite deal with the input. As you can see that we're basically just extracting 1 over here. Now the recipe obviously has the possibility, if you get it, that you can get the value here, and then here you could get the input item. This is going to be an ingredient though. So you would have to basically get the item stack. So you can see that it gets a little bit more complicated. You can get the item stack. You would then have to get the first item stack. And then here you would have to get the count of it. And then there you could also then say, hey, maybe we need, like, let's say 2 input slots, right? Or we need 2 items, and then that would actually extract them. Now, I don't think that this works quite perfectly just now, because I think that the ingredient, the way that is read in, is a little bit different. So you can't actually define an actual amount here yet, I believe. But once again, this is something that you can, of course, expand this, right? This code from. That would be absolutely totally fine. I highly recommend you actually do so. That, like I've already said, especially with these more complicated topics, get this to work once, have it like all working, and then just play around with this and do all sorts of crazy things with it. Highly recommend it you do so, because that is one of the best ways that you can learn. And finally, now that we have changed this is actually the entire change that we need for the block entity. It's pretty crazy that this actually that simple. And finally, we now just need the JSON files. Now we're going to make those in the data tutorial mod recipe folder. So we're going to go down to our assets, data, tutorial mod, and then a recipe. There we go. And I have 2 of them prepared, and I'm going to actually create a third one. So this is going to be obviously the bismuth from growth chamber. As you can see, we have a raw bismuth over here as an ingredient, and then a bismuth right here. Now, when you see the ingredient right here and you see the result, what did I tell you? Exactly what I told you over here. It's going to look for an ingredient field in the JSON file. Bam, there it is. And that is going to be the input item. And it's going to look for a result field. And whabam, there it is. And it's going to create that as an output item. That is exactly what we have over here. Hopefully understandable how those two connect. We also have an end rod right here where we get 2 end rods if we put in a stick. That's pretty neat, actually. And let's just copy this over one more time. I just dragged it into the same folder while holding control. And let's say we're going to get a diamond block from growth chamber. And let's just go crazy over here. If we were to put in a Minecraft : diamond, then all of a sudden I get a Minecraft : diamond underscore block out. Because why the frick not? It doesn't matter. We're just testing things out. Just do all sorts of crazy things. Obviously, don't put recipes like this inside of your game or inside of your mod if you want your mod not to be used, because obviously this sort of defeats the purpose of the game, right? Unless this is like something that takes, like, I don't know, like 3 in-game days or something like that, then you could argue. But regardless of that, though, that is the idea. And those 3 recipes will now totally work. All of them will work without an issue in our growth chamber block entity. So I'd say, let's jump into the game and see if it works. All right, I'm back in Minecraft, and let's take a look. Let's say, for example, if I take an emerald, right? Do you think something is going to craft? Well, of course not, because there is no recipe associated with an input of emerald. However, raw bismuth, as we've defined before, that of course still works, and it's going to yield 1 bismuth. That's pretty cool. Now, a stick, as you can see, all of a sudden also works, and it's going to yield 2 end rods, just like we've defined in the JSON file. And finally, a diamond. What is this going to yield? Of course, it's going to yield a diamond block, simply exactly how we've defined it in the JSON files, and that is a custom recipe type added to our crafting block entity. Absolutely fantastic, man. If you made it this far, once again, this is hopefully to be used as a template for you to continue to build upon, right? Get this to work once. Of course, use the GitHub repository linked in the description below. All of the code is there, so you can basically take it from there and then just go absolutely insane. Make some cool custom recipes. Of course, you can expand those. I highly recommend, like I said, both take a look at vanilla recipes. If you for example, have a block entity that has multiple inputs. Obviously, then it gets a little bit more complicated. Absolutely agreed. However, that's where you can both look at vanilla as well as other mods from on GitHub. Highly recommended to look there too, as those will help you immensely with everything like that. But for the time being, that's going to be it for this tutorial right here. Next time in this video, we'll add JEI compatibility to our mod. Hope to see you there. So, yeah.